Hello.
Hello. Buenas noches.
My name is Dr. Mark Niels. I am the Assistant Professor of History here at Western Wyoming Community College, and I'd like to welcome you to our Political Forum tonight. At the end of last semester, Professor Angela Thatcher, Bruce Anderson, and I decided to invite members of both the state political parties to meet at a round table and discuss issues most pertinent in the lives of Wyomingites. The upcoming election seemed like an appropriate backdrop, and we hoped that it would provide our students and the community members some food for thought as they head to the polls in November. Tonight's event is the fruit of that earlier idea. In advance, the people around this table submitted their suggestions for topics of discussion. We narrowed them to 6. Timeless principles of the Democratic and Republican parties, economics, civil liberties, education, healthcare, and civility and respect. My colleagues have also developed several questions under each of these subfields to aid in promoting a vigorous discussion. There will be a 1 hour and 10-minute discussion, and we will discuss these matters as much as possible. And at the end, there will be 20 minutes set aside for the audience to ask questions of the panel. Western Wyoming Community College seeks to foster an open and free exchange of ideas in a civil and respectful manner. As such, we ask the audience to please refrain from applause and/or interjection during the panel discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. I'm just going to step over here to the side so you can see these gentlemen as I introduce them. Chairman Frank Eathorne is a native of 42 years. If you just want to raise your hand so they know who I'm speaking about. Is a native of 42 years here in Wyoming. He is serving in his first term as state chairman of the Wyoming Republican Party. He operates the family ranch in Converse County with his wife, Teresa, and their 3 children. Chairman Joe Barbuto is chair of the Wyoming Democratic Party and lives in Rock Springs with his wife, Erin, their dogs, Molly and Chapter, and Henry the cat. He is currently a candidate for the Sweetwater County Board of Commissioners. RJ Pieper, is a lifelong resident of Rock Springs. He is currently the chairman of the Sweetwater County Democratic Party, and prior to serving as chair, he also served as treasurer. Representative Dan Zwonitzer is a 5th-generation resident of Cheyenne, serving his 7th term representing House District 43, serving as chairman of the Corporations, Elections, and Political Subdivisions Committee, and the Committee on Legislative Facilities, Technology, and Process. Outside of politics, he manages the Office of Academic Affairs at Laramie County Community College, and is a recent adoptive father of 2 boys from a foster care system. Representative John Freeman taught U.S. history and government for 32 years, including 23 years at Rock Springs Alternative High School. He has served on the Sweetwater County Outdoor Recreation Board, the City of Green River Recreation Advisory Committee, the Western Wyoming Community College Board of Trustees, and the Wyoming House of Representatives, where he currently serves on several committees. He is currently seeking his 5th term in the legislature. Clark Stith. Clark is a representative for the Wyoming State Legislature's House District 48. He has practiced law in Rock Springs since 1997, served on the Western Wyoming Community College's Board of Trustees from 2005 to 2010, and has taught criminal law and criminal procedure as an adjunct professor at Western in 2013 and 2014. Stan Blake was raised in Evanston, has lived in Sweetwater County for 28 years, and worked as a welder, iron worker, and railroad conductor. He's a member of the Fraternal Order of Eagles. He's a member of Smart Transportation Union and a member of the NRA. He served in the legislature for 12 years on the Agriculture, Public Lands and Water Resources, Transportation, Highways, and Military Affairs Committees, Select Water Committee, Select Tribal Relations Committee, and Select Federal Natural Resources Committee. And although I said to hold your applause until the end of tonight's panel, you may applaud our members currently. Gentlemen, at this time, I will ask the first question. The first question for tonight's panel deals with the issue of timeless and primary principles of the political parties. And the question is, what do your political parties respectively stand for in the state of Wyoming? Anyone who would like to take the microphone may begin this conversation.
Thank you for the question. I think this is a great question. The Republican Party believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We believe in the founder's vision of the proper role of government, and that allows citizens to flourish and enjoy their freedoms. We believe it's government's job to protect those freedoms and those rights. And going forward tonight, I just want to say that these gentlemen to my left have much more experience and in-depth. And my job is a little more jack of all trades, so if my answers are a little bit general and you want to ask specifics later, please take that opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here tonight, and thank you to Angela and Mark and the other professors who helped arrange this event. So I think, when I think about the Wyoming Democratic Party, you know, for most of its history, Sweetwater County has been a Democratic county, and certainly today, even though the voter registration doesn't reflect that, the people who hold office, the office holders, still does. And I think one of the principles that made me a Democrat and keeps me as a Democrat is that this is the party of working men and women. We believe that if you're not investing in them, if you're not making sure that they have access to quality health care, that everybody has an equal chance at a quality education, if we can still utilize and enjoy and explore our public lands, then you don't have much quality of life. And so when you invest in working folks, when you invest in everyday people, make sure they have that opportunity for the same things Frank just talked about, life, the pursuit of happiness, liberty. If you want those things to really happen, then you invest in folks. You make it a reality in their life, and that lifts the rest of us up. That lifts our economy up, that lifts our culture up, and that's what makes this country, this state, and certainly this county strong.
Well, perhaps I can expand on that by asking the next question that we had on the list here for the principles of parties, and it'll allow some of the other gentlemen on the panel to hopefully weigh in a little bit. So as much as these broad values are very important, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, of course, from the Declaration of Independence, a founding document of our country, how does your party go about allowing Wyoming citizens to accomplish those aims? And particularly, how does it allow citizens to engage in the democratic process in the state?
There we go. Well, I'll just talk on behalf of the legislature part of that. When we're in the legislative session, our caucus, the Democrat caucus, and it might have thrown you off a little bit that I was an NRA member, but I'm a Democrat. I'm a proud union member also. But in the legislature, when we have a caucus with all our legislatures, we don't need a very big room right now, but everyone is invited. Everyone, not just members of the House or Senate who are Democrats. We invite the press, we invite organizations to come in and tell us what's on their mind. Not what's on the party's mind, what's on their mind and how we can help them in Cheyenne. So I would like to say that.
Right, and thank you. My name is Clark Stith, representing from House District 48. I'm a Republican. The cultural values that I think the Republican Party embodies include self-reliance, individual responsibility, and individual freedom. So Republicans tend to believe that the government that governs the least governs the best. So Republicans typically are going to want to be for less governmental regulation of the economy and tend to give people more individual responsibility. So one bill, and to make this concrete, one bill that I sponsored that passed last session involved what I call the Medicaid Fairness Act. And what it deals with is if you're a single mother and you are entitled to have your the expenses of your pregnancy, for example, paid for through Title 19 Medicaid. You go to the hospital, and because you're low income, you qualify for Medicaid. But it might turn out that the father, who's single, the father might have a really good job and be making $80,000, $90,000 a year. And before, the law was that the father didn't have to contribute at all. But under current law, the Medicaid Fairness Act, effective July 1, 2018, a father who is above is higher income is going to have to pay up to half of the expenses for the birth costs of the child. So that's an example, I think, of a Republican principle of individual responsibility being combined with fairness in a very concrete way. I just want to plug my own bill there. Thank you.
Excellent.
I'm from a long line of Democrats, and when I was asked this by the press about 2 years ago, they said, "Why are you a Democrat?" And I talked about my family history. If you go up there, there's 4 generations of Freeman that are buried in the cemetery, and they're waiting for me, I think. And but anyway, my grandfather was a union organizer and a very hard worker. But it was very hard for a coal miner to make it to where that they can send their kids to college and do that kind of stuff. He was very much involved in the unions. He was a president for the state. He was an office holder for over 25 years. And a quick story is I looked just like him. And when I came back from California, people would look at me and they would say, "Are you related to John Freeman?" I was named after him. And I said, "Yes," and then I cringed because one of 2 things would happen. My grandfather was always with the grievance committee, and basically what happened was they either loved my grandfather or they hated my grandfather, depending on which side that they was. But he always stood up for what was right and what was equal, and for people to get ahead. My maternal grandfather was a farmer, and there was no harder person that worked, I think, on this earth. But if you know about the farming during the Great Depression, I mean, he lost crop after crop after crop. And, to stay on his farm was next to a miracle. And basically what happened is you have the Democratic Party led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt that put electricity on his farm. They gave him crop insurance, so when the grasshoppers came in, he had money to where he can go the next day. I think what Democrats have always done is tried to level the playing field so that if you are working hard, that you have a chance to make it.
Thanks. And I would do the inverse. That I come from a long line of Republicans, right? My parents were small business owners, were ranchers, and so somewhat your political party is based, at least initially, on your family history. And those of you who study history and the political parties over the last 200 years are well aware that many of their philosophies have flipped in some cases, starting from the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. And so I've struggled with this question a lot, as I think many people have. What, in today's climate, is a Republican versus a Democrat? Because both are all over the board. And so I've thought many nights of what makes me a Republican, why am I not a Democrat? Because I have different social views than a lot of other members of the Republican Party. But what I think it still comes down to, in my mind at least, for one person in society, is this, is that Republicans still fundamentally believe that you can be anything you want to be in life, regardless of your circumstance, regardless of where you're raised, you're born, or your childhood. If you want to pull yourself up and you want to make something of yourself, it is your individual responsibility to do so. And I certainly would say that Democrats tend to say, some people are born into really difficult life circumstances and they're never given a fair shot in life. And the Democratic Party, in my mind, personally, believes that sometimes they need some help, and you need a social safety net to help those people achieve equity, equality, their hopes and dreams. Where I would say Republicans tend to believe that, sometimes life sucks, but if you want to go make it, it's up to you. And certainly in a state like Wyoming, where we don't have a large number of urban centers and the same issues that other states do, it's easier to be a Republican in Wyoming because we don't see those same kind of issues that some of those urban centers in larger areas see. In Wyoming, I do think it's great that we still have that value that anybody born here really can do anything they want in life and make it with enough hard work and enough ambition.
So it sounds as though, we can all agree that the parties want what's best in their views for Wyomingites and really strive to offer Wyomingites an opportunity to have access to their government and to pursue those interests, what works for them, and they of course pick a party that does that. Some of you sort of hinted upon this, so I'd like you to expand on it if you would. We'll move into the realm of economics, talk about social safety nets and whatnot. One of the things that's going to affect us in the dialogue right now in the political debate here in the state is the issue of economic diversity. For instance, Representative Freeman spoke about sort of the boom and bust and how that brings people here or causes people to leave. How, in your minds, does Wyoming break its historical boom-bust cycle? Or, alternatively, is that just a part of who we are as a state, and that's part of our defining characteristic?
I think your statement and I want to say yes, it is, but it should be who we were. I've worked in my past. I've got 10 years of experience working in the oil and gas industry. My great-grandfather was a union coal miner. My dad still works in the energy industry. My uncles all work in the energy industry here in Wyoming, and I believe that it's been very great to me and my family and everybody I know who have been part of it. But it's not going to be sustainable in the future. We're in a pretty hard time as far as oil and gas prices go. The oil is not rising back to where it was. It's not $120 a barrel again, and frankly, it likely won't hit that again for decades. Coal prices have been on the decline for decades, since the 80s. And it's just been a very slow decline. We're going to see that in, there's a lot of students here. You will see that in your lifetime. You'll see the end of coal in your lifetime. And so Wyoming, we're a very coal and oil heavy economy. So if we don't do something now, if we're not proactive today, then we're going to be in a world of hurt, and we need to do something more. That's why we need to get out of this boom and bust cycle. That's why we need to find something, and we need to bolster everything we've got, from technology to other things, because the writing's on the wall, and we need to do something.
Thank you, and I believe on this issue, I don't think it's a partisan issue. That I don't think there's necessarily a Republican or a Democrat solution for Wyoming, because regardless of how we regard federal energy policy, we are probably faced with, as RJ Pieper just said, a situation, at least in Sweetwater County, where the Bridger Power Plant will not be functioning the way it is by 2032. It's not going to be functioning the same way. The Bridger coal mine will probably not be producing much coal in 2032. Black Butte Coal Company likewise will not be. That's a big issue, because that's 1,200 jobs on the Bridger side and another 400 on the Black Butte side. We've got to deal with that, and pretending it's not going to happen doesn't help anybody. We need to be practical. I think, broadly speaking, and this is not a specific solution, but broadly speaking, brain power is the future, and we have to figure out a way to invest in our university, invest in our community colleges, so that what we do is we create value-added human intellectual, human capital. Because the people who are going to control the future are going to be the people who own the intellectual property for the future. So we need to figure out a way to have business incubators. We need to figure out a way to have sort of invention or innovation centers. And we can and need to do that right here in Rock Springs, I believe. A lot easier said than done. I don't think this is, to solve the problem, I don't think requires you to necessarily, being from one party to the other isn't going to make the difference. We need to address the problem and try to solve it.
One of the issues I've seen in Wyoming is that we tend to react to issues rather than prepare for them. the point that Clark brought up just a moment ago, Representative Stith, excuse me, brought up about Jim Bridger Power Plant and Pacific Corp's plans to close all of their coal-fired power plants in Wyoming. That's a major issue. 1,200 jobs maybe here in Sweetwater County, direct jobs, a lot more indirect. And so I think, but it speaks to how we should be approaching these issues, and preparing for them now is the answer. A lot of times what happens when we in this boom and bust cycle is we go through a boom period, things are well, and then we hit a bust and the bottom falls out, and it's awful. We see families leaving Sweetwater County, we see them leave Wyoming, we see businesses closing, small businesses, big businesses. It's really a tough place to live, Wyoming, because of that cyclical economy. Based on 70% of our economy is based on mineral extraction and energy production. So we get to that point, we get to the bust, and then we start talking about, okay, what are we going to do, guys? How are we going to fix this? And maybe right when we're going to get more proactive about it, another boom hits, and we forget. We almost immediately forget what that bust was like. So it's even more of a vicious cycle. And so now I think, though, what you heard from Chairman Pieper and Representative Stith is that the economy is changing quickly, drastically. There's things happening around the world that impact the economy in Wyoming that we have no control over. But the result of it is that our boom and bust cycle, you're going to see a lot less of those booms, and when you do see them, they're going to be a lot less impactful. So absolutely, the path forward for Wyoming is that we have to start embracing the idea that regardless of what happens next with the economy, if we do get a bust, we have to have a plan in place. If they decide not to close Bridger Coal, we're glad to save those jobs, but having a plan in place is still going to be a good thing for Wyoming. So we need to actually sit down. I know the Endow Council has met. They've come up with a report that kind of scratched the surface on this issue at the state level, but we really need to get more aggressive about it. And when we do come up with something, when we do sit down and put this brain trust together and have these conversations and say, here's our steps, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, probably all the way to Z and past there, then we need to show some fidelity to that plan and not forget about it when that next bust comes along, or when that next boom comes along, because this is really, this is about whether Wyoming is going to have a viable economic future for you guys, for your kids, and for your grandkids. You're not just planning for this week and tomorrow, you're planning for many, many years down the road. But it's going to take some innovative thinking. It's going to take some courage on the part of a lot of elected leaders to embrace a new way of thinking, and we can do it. But I think also the folks in Wyoming, you guys, the constituents and voters, have to tell your elected officials this is what we want. We want our kids and our grandchildren to have a positive future.
I think we have to invest in our youth.
Oh, go ahead, John.
And my family follows the statistics. I have 3 sons, and according to the statistics, one's going to stay in Wyoming and 2 is going to leave. And that's exactly what's happened. And the one that's still in Wyoming wants to go back to Colorado. I was around my nephew and my son and a couple other people that were, in their mid-20s and stuff, and they all grew up in Wyoming, and I said, would you come back to Wyoming if there was a job for you? And it surprised me greatly that they said no. They liked all the amenities that they had in the big cities. They liked all the opportunities that were there. And in the legislature, we hear a lot if we reach out to former citizens, young citizens, that they'll come back. I'm not convinced of that unless we change to where our culture is more inclusive and invites people in there. If we don't, one of the big things on Endow is that we're going to educate people. We're going to get computer science in because that will help, and I think that that's a good thing. I voted against that bill because they didn't put any money so that we can educate people in computer science. I think it's the right thing to do, and it should be done. We talked about broadband. We need to be connected. The reason why Rock Springs is here is because 1, we have coal. 2, we have a railroad that goes through here. 3, we have an interstate that goes through here. And if we don't have that broadband, we're not going to stay here. Is the bottom line. Air service. We need more air service. So I think we're on the right path, and I don't think it's a partisan issue. But we've only scratched the surface. And if I knew more, I would make a grandiose speech, but I don't know.
Maybe I can make a grandiose speech. And I'll maybe bring it back a little bit partisan just to kind of explain where we've been and where we're going. And those of the people up here who all know me, I teach political science, I work at a community college. I am not anyone's definition of that partisan. The Democrats will tell you I'm pretty moderate. The Republicans will tell you I'm pretty moderate. So I kind of try to find the common ground. I'm very pragmatic. But let me tell you kind of politically where the philosophy is, why we have economic diversification problems in the state. And it's really this concept of, can we get businesses versus can we get the labor force? And so we have lots of businesses come to Wyoming and they say, hey, you don't have enough people here for us to build a manufacturing facility or for us to build some type of wind-generated power processing unit. You just don't have the people who have the skills. And so that's the argument, and I think everyone in the legislature agrees that's the argument. And so where it gets political somewhat is the Republicans tend to say, how do we attract businesses and how do we recruit? Do we do tax breaks? Do we do incentives? Where I would say the Democrats in the legislature are much more, we need to get a more educated labor force. Because we always have this chicken-egg problem of how do you get businesses and jobs here? And the businesses say we don't have enough educated population base. And so I would say, if I'm somewhat partisan, which I'm not, the Democrats say we need to invest in education. We need to get people the skills and the capacity to be able to take these jobs. Although the Republicans would then say, half of them leave the state, right? We have the Hathaway program. It maybe is the worst return on investment the state has ever made. Although it's great for those of you taking advantage, half of you are going to leave the state. And so the return to the state is really poor as an investment, besides that we're investing in your future and you're going to go take that somewhere else. And so I think that is where the political dynamics come into play, is are we recruiting businesses or are we educating our labor force? And that's the political dynamics in the legislature.
So, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to quote Representative Zwonitzer on the Hathaway Scholarship, but I will do that later on in the session. It's always kind of boggled my mind here. I work for the railroad. We haul Trona ash, or soda ash like you wouldn't believe, Trona. But yet, it's hauled to other places to make glass products. And I think Representative Freeman toured a place in Canada where we have water, we have the raw material, Trona. We should be making glass products here. We can take coal and make carbon products. So that's something that specifically here in Sweetwater County, Southwest Wyoming, and we've talked about it, we've worked on it, but we need to have it here. And possibly, if and when the coal mine shut down or the power plants, they can go to another industry. We got to incentivize them to bring them here. The Republicans will help us do that, and so we could work together, and we do work together in the Wyoming legislature. We really do. So here you go.
Thanks. I'm going to try not to talk too much this evening, but something Representative Zwonitzer said it stirred something up in my mind. When I was in the legislature in House District 48, and during my time in the legislature, I think that in those sessions we always saw this bill come forward. Well, first of all, who here likes, for instance, the Longmire television program? Anybody watch that? Raise your hand. That takes place in Wyoming, but it's filmed in New Mexico. And a lot of places in films that are supposed to be Wyoming are either British Columbia or New Mexico in actuality. And so the question has always been, are we going to get some productions to come to Wyoming and film movies and shows here that are about Wyoming? Maybe they're not about Wyoming. Maybe they just need a pretty landscape or a desert landscape or a barren landscape, depending on what part of the state you're in, I suppose. So the question was, how do we get them here? And so we would pass these tax incentives for film productions to come to Wyoming. They would get a break if they would film their movie or television program or whatever else in the state. I think it has had a little impact. I think we've seen a few more productions come here, but really not many. Certainly it hasn't become a booming industry in Wyoming. It may never become a booming industry. But back to what Dan said about whether are you going to provide things like tax incentives and breaks, or are you going to provide education? What's keeping them from coming here? Probably a lot of things, but one of the major things is they don't have an educated workforce here. in Wyoming, they don't have a skilled workforce here to work on those productions. So rather than going after a tax incentive or a tax break for these productions to come in here, why not take the dollars and invest them in a program at one of our community colleges or the university or several institutions, and make that skilled labor force so that Wyoming does become a little more enticing to things like that. And you could say that about a lot of industries that we want to bring here, or different kind of businesses, but just something I wanted to throw out there, that I do think that investment in education and workforce development really matters for our state, and especially if we do want to talk about new businesses, whether it's manufacturing or anything else, we've got to look at first, in a planning process, what do we want, and then how are we going to invest in the education so we have the workforce so that those businesses and industries want to come here.
So a lot of you have spoken already on the issue of education, but since you've touched upon it, maybe we should move and speak to that issue just a little bit more in depth. Obviously, education is an enormous part of Wyoming's government. How does state government, according to party principles, responsibly and properly fund public education as mandated by the state constitution?
Oh, you want to go? I'll just speak briefly.
Another principle I think Republicans believe in strongly is the separation of powers, because Republicans tend to be suspicious of power because we believe that if people get power, they'll tend to abuse it. And so the one way to guard against that is to have separate branches of government. You've got the executive branch, you've got the legislature, and you've got the courts. I don't know if I speak for everyone in the Republican Party, but I certainly believe that it was misguided for the Wyoming Supreme Court to overstep its boundaries in 2002 in the Campbell II decision, which essentially mandated that the legislature spend X dollars on K through 12 education. It distorted the state government, and so what you had was effectively a misallocation of resources to K through 12. I'm a big believer that we should generously fund K through 12. But from a party principle point of view, it sort of offends me that the Supreme Court essentially told the legislature, you have to do this. You can't make a decision. You can't listen to the voters. We on the Supreme Court are going to tell you how you're going to fund K through 12. So where parties might actually make a difference. It's certainly been good for teachers. Teacher salaries have gone way, way up, at least over the last 20 years. I know in the last 5 years they haven't gone up with inflation, and they're unhappy about that. That's K through 12. On the university side, again, there's really, having said that about separation of powers, I nonetheless believe that there's no better way to spend government dollars, taxpayer dollars, than to invest in education, because it's an investment that can pay off in the future. So.
I've been on the Education Committee for the last 8 years, and it used to be that the Judicial Committee and the Appropriations Committee is one that spends all the midnight hours and to find out what's going on. And what's happened in the last 3 years, probably 4 years, is the Education Committee is doing as much as what everybody else is. Depending on who you talk to and how they do the numbers, some people say that we're $1 billion underwater for education. Representative Stith talked about the Supreme Court decision, and that Supreme Court decision interpreted the Constitution that said the primary purpose of government is to educate its citizens. And that was their interpretation of that. And then what happens is then state government is required to fund what it costs. And one of the reasons why I've been spending so much time in committee is what does it cost to educate K-12 students? I think that the current number is that we're only about $200 million short, and which is a lot better than $1 billion, but it's still a lot of money. And then what is a quality education? And then what happens is once you define a quality education, then you have to determine how it's equitable. Is a education that you get in Rock Springs, Wyoming, the same as what happens in Baggs, Wyoming? And if you look at the test scores, one of the things, and we can explain it, is if you go to Baggs, they have a lot better test scores. And they probably have a lot more soft skills because they know their teachers and they know all that other stuff than what you do in Rock Springs High School or Black Butte or those things. So we have to balance all of those things and come up with a number that we can fund. And I think that it's interesting that, again, the reports that are coming back for economic diversification is that you have to spend more money and you have to get people educated. And one of the big things that we have problems with right now is to get a qualified workforce coming out of the high schools. And yet we have this wonderful scholarship that's the envy around the country called the Hathaway. But the Hathaway is choking out career and technical education. So there's been a lot of people that are hanging on to what the initial principles of the Hathaway was, and we're not changing it to where that we not only get people academically ready to come to a community college, but we should also get them with the mechanical background or the aptitude to where they can do as well in the T&I wing in here or going straight to the workforce. But if we're already $200 million short, or up to $1 billion, depending on whose numbers you want to use, how do we do that?
And so back to the partisan argument is we're $200 million short, and I would say it's $300 million, but it's it's how you quantify these numbers, right? Education is important, and nobody, Republican or Democrat, is saying education isn't important. But I think everybody in this room knows you can always fund education more, right? You can get new computers every year. Your teachers can make more money. You can have more study abroad, right? And so, sometimes education is referred to as a black hole. And so when you have Republicans who are saying, how much is enough? For this $200 million deficit, do we need to raise taxes for that? Do we have to find other revenue streams because our Constitution says education comes first, right? Before we pay for prisons, before we pay for family services, before we pay for anything else in state government, education's number one. But the more you pay for education, it hurts everything else in state government across the board. And so there's a point where you have to say, we have to cut education. At least as a Republican, that's what I say, right? You just can't keep funding it. Now I think we're number 3, and it changes every 6 months on how much we are. But I think right now, last I looked, we're number 3 per student in the country in education spending, and we're number 7 in quality of education. So we're doing something right. Our kids are getting educated. But there's got to be a point where you say money has to go around. Is it worth raising taxes? And Republicans will tell you generally, we hate raising taxes, right? I mean, nobody likes raising taxes. But that's really the give and take, is that you can always fund education more. And we know it, Republicans know it. But what's the point where every kid gets a quality education and we can still pay for the gamut of education services in the state? Because our Constitution says every kid has to have an equal education no matter where they are, which is tough as heck because you're finding the least common denominator in the state, wherever it's probably a rural place, and you have to say they get the same education as somewhere in a big city in Wyoming. And how do you quantify that, right? It costs a heck of a lot more money to make sure that small town kid in Wyoming is getting the same quality education when you have economies of scale in a city like Rock Springs, Cheyenne, Casper, Laramie, Sheridan, Jackson, right? Because everybody in Jackson is given way too much to their kid. And so that's really the political dichotomy, is how much do you fund education at the expense of everything else, at the expense of how much do you raise taxes? And those are the kind of the arguments that we get involved in. And there's no black or white answer is the problem. And that's just where we all fundamentally can disagree on what the number is, how much do you spend, how much do you cut, where do you put other government money at?
All right. Moving along to a different aspect of the economy, we've talked about spending for education and the importance of a diverse economy in the state of Wyoming. Let's take a moment and hit upon healthcare, which is a very hot button issue, of course, in many state races across the country even, it's coming up. What responsibility does the state have to help Wyoming citizens with the costs of health care and with the acquirement of health insurance?
Well, that's not one of my committees, but we had the opportunity to expand Medicaid, and we didn't do it, and we should have. It would have saved us. So that's our money going to the federal government, but not coming back to help citizens in Wyoming who can't afford health care. So if you can't afford health care, what do? Just sit in your room and die? No, you go to the emergency room, and then you don't pay your bill, and then the hospital's stuck with the bill, which means higher prices for everybody else. So I see down in Utah, it's on their, it's a proposition. I can't remember which one it is, but they're gonna vote whether they want to expand Medicaid. And maybe that's what the state of Wyoming should have done, I don't know. But the legislature was just against it. And I think part of it was because it was called Obamacare. And I don't know, maybe if it was called some other president care, maybe they would have jumped on board. But I don't want to get too partisan here, but isn't that what we're doing? No. But we should have expanded Medicaid when we had the chance. Would have saved us money. Now we have, what, one insurer in the state? We lost the other insurers we had. So, you know, in my mind, we should have expanded Medicaid. And so Utah's going to get the chance to vote on it. We'll see where that goes. But people who are poor and down and out, should they get health care? Yes. Yes, they should. We're a civilization. Everyone should. Should it be socialized medicine across the board for everybody? I don't know. Maybe so. But we should have expanded when we had the chance. We would have saved a lot of money. And we probably still could do it and save some money, but I don't think we're going down that road again.
Now for the opposing view. Think about if you bought your groceries the way you pay for medical services. Imagine you go into the grocery store, you go around and you fill up your cart with what you want to eat, and there are no prices on anything. You have no idea what any of the things cost. You don't know what the fruit costs or the bread or the meat. You just put whatever you want in your cart. You go to the cash register, okay? They ring you up. It's $400. And they say, well, it's $400, and we'll send this to your insurance company, right, who will then pay some part of it, and then you'll pay 20% of it, okay? That's how the healthcare industry works, right? And the fundamental problem with healthcare is that for the individual consumer, one, you don't know the price of anything, right? When you're buying it. There's no law in Wyoming that requires a doctor to tell you how much this procedure is going to cost. If you're in the emergency room and they say, we'd like to fly you to Salt Lake because we think we don't want to deal with you anymore, or you're having a heart attack, you know, you need to go to Salt Lake, right? They just put you on the helicopter flight, and no one says, oh, by the way, the helicopter flight's $32,000, okay? But Guardian Flight, in fact, charges $32,000 for the 45-minute flight from Rock Springs to Salt Lake City, okay? Now, you can go to the Grand Canyon and take a 45-minute helicopter ride for about $500, okay? That's how broken the system is. But if you put a nurse on the helicopter, suddenly it costs $30,000. The healthcare it's like this big forest weeds, extremely complicated and difficult to solve, okay? I believe that the approach, I think, is that we should go at it in small, individual ways to try to save money. So back to the Medicaid Fairness Act, that should save Wyoming about $2 to $5 million a year. Hopefully that will work. Doesn't solve the whole problem, doesn't solve a huge piece of the problem, it solves part of it. You get people thinking about spending their own money, that's the right, in my view, the right approach. So we could talk a lot more about that, but I'll turn it over to the Democratic chairman.
Well, I think it's important, too, to remember that there were a lot of people who couldn't even go in the grocery store in the first place prior to the Affordable Care Act, and probably still now. And what Representative Blake said is absolutely true. How many people, these guys are still legislators, so they probably have the current figures. I mean, how many people in this state are still without health care coverage because we chose not to expand Medicaid? I think the last figure I saw was around 34,000. If you're looking at it economically, how many $billion have we lost over a decade by turning this down? And by the way, imagine you're going back to that grocery store and you're giving them money, but you're not getting anything because they're sending your groceries to New York or California. That's what's happening with your tax dollars right now. You're paying to expand Medicaid, you're just doing it in other states, not in Wyoming, and that's a shame. And when I was in the legislature, we went from when I was first there, I think that the divides were more along geographic lines than ideological or political, but towards the end, when we started talking about health care, I definitely saw some people approaching this from a much more ideological place than a practical place. Fine, you hate the president at the time, you hate the Democratic Party, but there was a strong moral argument for doing this, for taking care of people. And go back to freedom. If you want freedom, I'll tell you what, you don't have freedom if you don't have good health. You don't have a strong economy unless you have a healthy population, a healthy workforce. And so there's a strong moral argument for having expanded Medicaid, and there's a strong economic argument for doing so as well. So I don't know, maybe one of the legislators now can tell me, is that option off the table now? Can we still expand Medicaid, or is that something that we just watch sail by?
I think it still could be, but I don't know.
But we've already forfeited a lot of dollars, right? And so, I don't know, I think that we missed an incredible opportunity there based on partisan lines. So I'll pass it down to one of these other gentlemen.
Thank you, Joe, and Representative Stith. I appreciate all your comments on this. When I speak, what I'm trying to do, the job that I was elected to do by those that were elected to do their job, which goes back to how can you get involved, if I could go back to that just for a second. Civically, in Wyoming, whether either party, you can get involved at the grassroots level at your county. We have 23 counties, we have 23 county parties. Those leaders from those counties make up the State Central Committee and elect an executive committee. So that's how I got here. I started in the grassroots. I haven't been a legislator. I've not been elected to office. I represent the grassroots. And specifically, my job is to represent the values in this document, which is passed by 500, give or take, delegates from around the state. That convention takes place every 2 years. And you all can be involved in that. How many in here are over 18? And if you are registered to vote, you are eligible to be involved in your county party, state party, and so on and so forth. So let me get back to, and I want to encourage you to do that. And I also have some of these books. These are the extra books for you to pick up. I have more out in the parking lot. They're the platform, resolutions, and bylaws. Mostly what we're talking about for purposes on these topics is the platform and resolutions. They're issues oriented. So healthcare, Republicans believe that we need to make a fundamental decision, and that is healthcare a right or is it not a right? And then I would break that into another question. We need to fundamentally answer, is it the responsibility of government? If you look back before government was involved in healthcare at all, it was neighbors taking care of neighbors, families generating.
I sit right next to him, so I have to correct him all the time also. But he's absolutely right. We get up and we shake each other's hands. And right now in the legislature, if you don't have a Republican co-sponsor on your bill, it's probably not going to go anywhere. So I've sponsored bills. I've been co-sponsors with Republicans. And for 6 years, I sat in the Ag Committee with Representative Zwonitzer. And every time he would come up with some crazy amendment that he wanted to talk about, well, so you propose an amendment, then you need a second. And everybody would just sit there and I'd go, I'll second that. And so, because I wanted to hear, because Representative Zwonitzer is a sharp cookie. Or is it Zwonitzer? I can't remember. Zwonitzer. He's a smart guy, and I enjoy working with him. I admire working with him. He's a class act, and he's smart. But I enjoyed my time on the Ag Committee with him because he has some interesting ideas that a lot of other people in that Ag Committee didn't have. So we do get along. But I have seen it get a little worse every year, just a little bit, as I think the national scene becomes more and more divided. I see it creeping in a little bit more, but every speaker I've been under has been a good speaker, has treated Democrats fair, and but I see it creeping in a little bit, and I want it to go back to the way when I first came in, and very civil, and it is. We work what's best for Wyoming. We really try to work what's best for Wyoming and pass what's best for Wyoming.
And I would echo that. I think I'm third in seniority, stands fourth. And we call each other by our first names because when you're in a room stuck with people for 40 days, for a year, for 8-10 hours a day, you get to know everything you can about them. Their dogs, their kids' names, their life history. That helps you be a better politician because you kind of know how to phrase certain things. But the one thing we always do in the legislature is we talk about protecting the institution. Because every legislator has been there a couple terms. We know people have had fights 100 years ago, and they're going to have fights 100 years. And the goal is that we keep the institution and the rules of the institution, we call them sideboards, right? So our arguments, our debates, our tactics, our practices, if we go too far out of line, someone will call a rules committee. And I've done it many times on my own party members, because when they cross the line, we have institutional rules to ensure decorum. And I think that's one super healthy part of it, is that we have those rules in place. And the other is we do have receptions at night, and we have weekends where we're all going to breakfast together. A lot of the work gets done in the interpersonal conversations that we have, not on the floor and we have long debates with each other, but when you go to the back room and say, what do you think about this? What could you use? How do we get this pushed? What's the consensus argument? That's how a lot of the work gets done in Wyoming, is these relationships that we've built over 12 years, Stan and I, sitting there and ag together and him seconding everything. When he has a good idea and he says, hey, I need chairman of corporation sponsorship on this, I'm pretty likely to say yes if he talks to me because we have this 12-year history and I trust him. When he says, this isn't partisan, this isn't a crazy idea, it sounds crazy, but it's good to go, I listen because those are the relationships you build up over time.
I'm not sure your batteries worked. Well, I'll talk loud if you. No. That's right. No batteries in right. Here.
There you go.
So what I'll do is I wanted to say that I used to work in conservation in public lands and things like that, and last winter I got a chance to go down to the legislature to talk to some of these elected officials down there, and I saw just that. I saw Republicans and Democrats treating each other like they were best friends. They work together. They have to work together, or else nothing gets done. And I think that's a really great thing, and I do hope that ends up happening on the national level again. But outside of the legislature, even I think there's a civility that needs to happen. And we have social media these days. There's just so much divisiveness and things that it makes things hard to keep this civility in mind. And the thing that really that grounds me is in my conservation work. Recently there was an issue that part of the Red Desert just north of town was in danger, and I went to all 6 Sweetwater County legislators, 5 Democrats, 1 Republican, and I went to them. I said, hey, I want your support on this. I want you to tell the governor that, hey, we can't be sacrificing this small chunk of land because it's so unique. And there was some misunderstandings, and he was out of town. But Representative Stith was one of the first people I wanted to contact, and it's not because just because he's a legislator, my legislator even, but it's because I also have a healthy respect for him. He's sat on the Rock Springs City Council for a number of years in Ward 1, and I would venture to say he was one of the best we've ever had in recent history because Clark would ask questions, he would create debate, he would find common ground on an issue, and then he would vote that way. he didn't just rubber stamp like a lot of them do, and for that, even though we don't agree on 99% of issues, and I did fervently fight his appointment, I respect him because he was a good city councilman.
Rebuttal?
No, it is true. We are lucky here, I think, in Sweetwater County and Wyoming generally that we treat each other as individuals, as human beings. And so Joe Barbuto, a friend of mine, RJ Pieper, a friend of mine. And so when a year ago, or a little over a year ago, I was appointed to fill a vacancy in House District 48, both RJ and Joe were very adamantly fighting that appointment. And, you know, taking the position effectively that it was a crime, that instead of being in the legislature, I should be seated in jail, right? So, but on the other, but what I thought was relatively civilized about it was that we know each other as individuals, as people. So we're friends. We can take different positions, but nonetheless get things done and have a healthy debate. And I think so. I think politics is how we get things done. Politics can be a good thing. Politics, in the best sense, can be a really worthy enterprise. Thank you.
Would anyone else like to weigh in before we open?
I'd just like to add that in my observations, civility and respect is alive and well in Wyoming. And we need to be because we're a small state. And just like we talked about tonight, I didn't know all these gentlemen, but I admire and respect each one of them for their civil service. And even if I disagree with some of their views, I respect them for having it and standing up for it. That being said, if one of them is the one stuck in the snowdrift, I need to go help him. Thank you for that analogy tonight, Stan, because next time it might be me stuck. And even if we were, assumedly from ideologically, politically different spectrums, we need to help each other out. Wyoming is a tough place to live. And so I want to bring this to the relevance of your folks here, students and adults in here in this class in attendance tonight. Because of the fact of the environment that we're in, if you're tempted, and believe me, I was your age once, rambunctious college student, maybe wanted to ramp up some excitement here and there, and there's temptation to mistreat people. And sometimes it takes a hard lesson to learn that that's not acceptable. It's much more valuable to treat someone as you wish to be treated. And we had similar conversations of that tonight while we were being treated to food and drink by the college prior to this time. And I just want to challenge each one of you, if you're tempted to mistreat somebody, just think about you might be the next one in a bind and needing that very person to bail you out of a bind.
Just briefly, well, first of all, I want to say that I don't think, just to clear the air, I don't think anybody wanted Clark to go to jail. At least not for that. But I think that something I've learned, whether it's in party politics or as a legislator or anywhere else, there's always a lot more that unites us than divides us, and when you can figure out what that is, you can find a way forward, but people have to be willing to compromise, and you have to be willing to look at things from a different perspective than maybe you're comfortable with sometimes. But there usually is a way forward. And you can still disagree with people. You can have really heated disagreements or really heartfelt disagreements, but you don't always have to do it in a disagreeable way. That's probably easier to do here at the local level because, like everyone up here said, we're friends. We know each other. We see each other in the community. Our relationship just isn't as politicos, but as neighbors and friends and people who have to work together. I think, though, when you're looking at this, especially at the national level and maybe the state level as well, you guys all have a responsibility in this too. So I'll tell you something, maybe approaching this just a little differently. Don't elect people who can't behave civilly. Don't cast your votes for people who are going to embarrass you once they're elected. And that means that you have to be educated as voters. You have to take time to learn about the candidates. You have to listen to what they're saying. You're going to have to do your own research. And the other part of that, somebody brought up social media. You can share things on social media that you think are the absolute truth, and chances are you can find a citation that says it is the truth. But I would beg of you, all of you, everybody in this room, that when you are talking with folks on social media, when you are sharing things, do your due diligence. Find out if what you're saying is true. Find out if there's actually anything factual. This goes for Democrats, Republicans, and independents alike. Make sure what you're sharing is accurate. Don't create division amongst yourselves based on things that just aren't true. So I think that probably political parties at some point in the very near future are going to be a lot less popular than they have been in the past. We see trends moving that way, that where more people are becoming independents or unaffiliated. And I think that your generation and the generation after you are probably going to be the ones who accomplish that. But in the meantime, just educate yourselves about what's happening. Educate yourself about the people you're voting for, and take ownership of what's happening on the national, state, and local stages.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. If you would all like to join me in a round of applause for these gentlemen. At this time, we'll go ahead and open the floor for Q&A. I'll have a microphone here, so please excuse me if I have to kind of run around the room a little bit. We'll start here, and I'll work my way around.
Excuse me. My name is Shane. The sheriff. I'm sorry, phone. I want to thank you guys for being here and putting on a good example for all of us in civility and getting along. It was easy to see. You guys joked, made some light of things, and all. We're able to laugh together, help lighten things up, and I appreciate that. So many questions that I have. I know I'm limited to just one, so I'm going to kind of make it about the healthcare issue. And I think one thing that we really need to do when we look at healthcare issue is we need to change some terminology. We don't have a problem with healthcare in the United States. We don't have a problem with healthcare in Wyoming. We have a problem with health cost. We have some of the best health care in the world. People come from all over the world to the United States to get health care. We have health care. The problem is accessing it. I lost my job in the oil field. I was on what was called Obamacare or government care, whatever you want to call it. The problem with it is it works in the opposite way that it should. When I had absolutely nothing and no income and I was not drawing a paycheck, the government was more than happy to say, your cost is $7 a month. And then my wife got a job, a very low-paying job at $10 an hour, and that went up to $1,000 a month. And then all of a sudden she gets $1 an hour wage, which comes out to $2,000 a year. Do you know how much that is a month? That's not much. Guess what? Our health care costs went up per month. That's not sustainable for a family. So your son who's working 70, 80 hours a week is making too much to qualify for that government health care. As long as we're willing to stay down and let government take care of everything, they're willing to pay. And that's not sustainable either. We can't do that. It has to go the other way. So what are your ideas on proposing, looking at changing it from health care to health cost? And how do we change gears to go to say, we want to help you up and move you forward and not take those benefits away from you? When you only make a few dollars a month, we can't charge you a few $1,000s a month.
Let me just answer a piece of that. I think one concrete, simple, achievable thing that the Wyoming legislature could do about it would be to require some transparency in pricing. So just like at the grocery store, you know what the price of the food is you're buying. It seems like at the ER or at the doctor's office, they should be disclosing to you the price of what it's going to cost before you pay for it. That's not going to solve all the problems, but that's a step in the right direction, because the more people feel like they're spending their own money to do something, the more they're likely to drive the cost down. Because when you look at a hospital bill later, as everybody knows, you've got charges for simple things, aspirins, Q-tips, that are, unreasonable on their face. And if they had to disclose that to you at first, they might make the decision, gee, we don't want to look like such charlatans at the outset, right? So that it's not going to solve the whole problem, just a piece of it.
Unless anybody else has a way in? Let's go. I'm going to try to give equal access to both sides of the room here.
I wanted to add on to that. So I lived in England for 5 years, and then I was privileged to experience the National Health Service, or NHS, which is a free health service in England. Why do you think that America hasn't adopted that system? And I will draw an analogy, gun control. So we have the small group of population that abuses guns, correct? And then we can assume that a small population, or maybe a bigger one, will abuse our free health care. How many engineers, doctors, educators, how many leaders of America in the future are we losing because we refuse to help them with their health issues?
I slightly push back. I don't think anybody abuses healthcare, right? I mean, it's an opportunity. Your kid's sick, you're not sure what's wrong with them, you're not feeling well. If you don't have an income and you get basically cheaper medical care, you're going to go to the ER and you're going to make sure you're not dying or don't have cancer. I mean, it's those people who know what it costs insurance-wise. If they go to the medical center, they know what they're going to have to pay, and they say, am I really that sick? Let me give it one more day, see if I get better. Instead of the people that don't have to pay the cost, they're going to go right away, and that's just the marketplace. And I'll just be very honest. All 50 states are trying to deal with this problem. Nobody up here, in my opinion, is going to give you some magic bullet that is going to solve the healthcare problem in this country. I will say that one of the biggest problems we face is that insurance is state-based. And so the question is, if you want the federal government to do something about health insurance, you can either give up your rights to the state and say, feds, you are in charge of all Americans and their health care costs, and federalize insurance. I don't think the majority of the country is ready to go there yet, but otherwise you have to work with every single state's healthcare system independently. And I think I can be totally honest when I say that Wyoming, in my opinion, has done almost everything that we can, besides Medicaid expansion, to try to get healthcare costs down. The problem is we are a rural state, and the cost of care here is much greater than almost anywhere else based on economies of scale. If you take out big cities in almost any other state, it's a comparable cost. Western Colorado, which is near you guys, is very similar if you take out the Front Range. And that's just how it is. So until we either have a federal solution or the states all say, hey, we don't want insurance to be state-based anymore, and we're willing to give up that freedom, nothing's going to change. Wyoming in 2009, we always talk about state health care across state lines. We've had that in the state since 2009. Georgia and Maryland are the other two states. Nobody will take Wyoming on because the cost of care here is so great. No other insurance in any other state is going to say, hey, let's take Wyoming into our pool because they lose money. Until we find a way to either subsidize that with your tax dollars, that's a bad idea, see? Right? There's no easy solution, but I would say that Wyoming has diligently tried anything that we can to be taken on by other states to reduce the cost of care. We have so few insurers, and we have a rural population.
Yeah,
Oh.
Can you pass down, Mike?
Oh, yeah.
I'll just go way off the deep end here. I think we should have a single payer system in the whole United States. And Washington, D.C. needs to figure that out. The costs are insane. But the real problem is the money involved. You've got lobbyists for the big pharmaceuticals. You got lobbyists for the hospitals. You got lobbyists for the insurance. That's who runs Washington, D.C., or all the lobbyists. As soon as you get all the money out of politics, then we could go somewhere. But until that day, a corporation is a citizen now, I guess, is what they said. So that's where all the problem is in Washington, D.C., money. Every senator, every congressman up there is owned by somebody. Years ago, I served with a guy named Mike Gilmore, and a senator was in an elevator with us at the University of Wyoming. And Mike had had a couple of drinks. And he says, you know what, you should be like the race car drivers. You should put who owns you right on your suit. Is it Pfizer? Is it Tenica or ExxonMobil? But that's the problem. we should go to a single payer system, and I'm probably a real radical, wild-eyed Democrat, but
There's a couple of
thanks.
radicals in the room here. Yeah, got a question right here.
We brought up a subject that I run into this afternoon. I went to the pharmacy, and the lady ahead of me, she was an older lady, started to cry. And I was listening, and they couldn't comfort her. And what she was saying, in the United States of America, that she had an older daughter that had not taken her medications for 2 weeks, and she was dying. And they said, well, here's the things, and they said, okay, it's $380. And she says, I don't have $380. And she started to cry even more. And I thought, what the hell's going on? We're like a third world country. Somebody's going to die because they can't get medications. And they don't understand the system a lot either, to work the systems to get it. So I've been down for about 4 hours and depressed. And it's funny that this came up, but we are like a third world country in the way, some ways we're delivered health care.
We have a question up here.
I think you have a response here.
Oh, is there a response?
I
Please, go
agree
ahead.
with you totally. My dad had Parkinson's. He would go down to Nogales, Mexico, to get the same medication. A lot of the medication we take right now is probably manufactured in Mexico. But yet, why does it cost so much less in Mexico or Canada or wherever? Why are our prices so high in the United States? I don't know the answer, but I think the answer is probably greed.
Wyoming is the most challenging state to try to get any health care coverage. Absolutely. This gentleman here was talking about his experience, and our experience is self-employed. Now, try to pay the self-employment rate and go find your own insurance that covers your family. It's not sustainable. You have to be in the six-figure mark, just clearing that each year to make your health care payments. What I learned during the campaign season this year is this issue just keeps coming up because it's hugely important and it's a monster to tackle, and that is, why are the costs so high? It is over-regulation. We have regulators in DC that's their job to come up with regulations, and they create and produce stacks and stacks and stacks day after day, week after week. They get paid for that, but we get to pay for it. And in that, we also lose out because there's no disclosure, as Representative Stith talked about, of procedure prices and medication prices. So the $380, that's a shocker. If you go pharmacy shopping, you might find a $3.80 prescription. Probably doubtful, but when you look at procedures, they range all over the board. And that's because with their failure to disclose the prices, we don't have a fair market to do comparison, and it takes competition out. You add that to the regulation in the medical industry, and they've got us by the throat.
You know, Stan Blake, Representative Blake here already responded to this, Leighton's remarks before. I mean, medication costs are high in this country because Big Pharma is spending billions of dollars lobbying your United States senators and representatives to make sure that they continue to make those incredible profits. And they make sure that the policies reflect that too. We can't negotiate for mass prescription prices in the United States. That's because of Big Pharma. Healthcare costs, regardless of what system you're under in Wyoming right now, are always going to be high because there is no competitiveness in this market. If you want to see your general health care costs go down for your premiums, through your insurance providers, then you have to have some competitiveness. And we're a rural state. We don't have big metro areas. We don't have a lot of doctors either. And so you don't see that a lot of differentiation in the cost. And so that doesn't allow insurers actually to be able to drive down their costs because they have no need in Wyoming to be competitive.
I'll be real brief. My mother went and got some drugs, and it cost her about $45. It was about a $250 prescription, and she has health insurance to where it brings down the cost. I bought the same drug, and my insurance was a lot better, and I only paid $5.
We have a question here.
The money issue really tires me out, okay? All that is an excuse. You don't waste, well, the feds don't waste a second bailing out the banks, which was the biggest corporate welfare scam of the century. And the $1 trillion didn't bother any of you, okay? And then on top of that, the Fed gave out another something like $6 trillion in quantitative easement. And you guys have the audacity to say, we can't afford health care? Come on, get serious. I agree with you. It needs to be Medicare E for everybody, and it can be funded. But it takes a can-do, clear conscience to do it.
Oh, well, let me respond then, because I'm not usually that Republican, but a couple of things. So I'll just give you an example, and I'm usually not a bastard, but I'm just going to be, right? There's 100 of you, give or take, in this room, okay? Some of you know each other, some of you don't. One of you gets cancer, $1 million. Is everybody else in this room right now going to give that person $5,000 right now? You're just going to say, hey, I'm really sorry, but here's $5,000, and I hope you get your cancer cured. And that, for some of you, $5,000 is easy. For others of you, that's going to set you back 5 or 6 years, right? You're getting an education, you're trying to pay off student loans. We can do it as a government, right? We can do what Europe does. We can raise your taxes. You can pay 20% of your income into a system that covers medical care for everybody. And we can. It's not that we can't. It's just that a large majority of people don't want to. And I'm sorry, society's changed, right? We don't know each other. We don't all love each other. We're not one big happy family. We have 340 million Americans. Half of you don't really care if some other people, live 6 months longer. I mean, I'm not trying to be rude about the pharmacy companies. I don't love big pharma, but I'll tell you that 30 years ago, people died at 70. People are living till 90 now. Most of that reason is because we have cool new drugs like Lipitor, like Coumadin, that keep people alive 10 or 15 years longer. There's a cost to invent those, right? Pharmaceutical companies spend 10 or 15 years testing those, developing those, having lots of clinical trials. They spend tens of millions of dollars, and they have to recoup those costs so they can find the next cool drug that saves people and lets them live 5 years longer. And that's just how society works, right? I mean, when we talk about healthcare, 60% of your healthcare costs will come in the last 4 years of your life, right? Other countries have developed systems that, they're little artificial timelines that say, after 70, you can't get this operation. After 80, you can't get these type of drugs anymore, right? We can do that as a society and kill grandma, but nobody wants that, right? We all want to live forever. You're 94, you're going to spend all the money you can and do all the Medicare you can to make sure you live to 96, and that's what you want. That's what I want. But that's the cost. I mean, that's the inverse that nobody likes to talk about, that it's horribly sad, right? People die, people get diseases. It's not fair, right? It wasn't fair 100 years ago. It wasn't fair 1,000 years ago. Is it fair to have everybody else cover your costs or the government cover your costs through taxation? I don't know. It probably is. Other countries do it. And the good news for those of you who right now are thinking I'm a bastard is I can look at the next 20 years and the system is going to collapse. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that any of you right now who are under the age of 35, you don't have to worry about what anybody over 50 right now has to deal with, right? Because a lot of them are working until they're 65 just so they can hit retirement age and get Medicare, right? That's why we have all these problems with baby boomers in our society. They won't retire because they need that health insurance coverage. And now I'm rambling. All right, and so now everybody, this is what happens when you invite Cheyenne legislators.
Nobody wants
yeah.
to kill grandma.
And it's a hard truth. It is, right?
Sure.
I mean, it just, people want to live longer and they need that medical coverage and it costs money.
Yeah.
And it does, and it sucks.
Chairman Barbuto?
It is expensive to produce drugs, there's no doubt about it, but part of that expense is that they want to make those big profit margins. I mean, those guys, they're not investing in your senators and representatives just because they want to make sure those new drugs can get on the market and you can live longer and have a better quality of life in your later years. They want to make those big margins, and that's what's driving the cost of pharmaceuticals up. I mean, don't kid yourself. That's where the expense is coming to you from. So I agree with some of what Representative Zwonitzer said. He's one of my dear friends, but I think that not acknowledging that fact is doing a real disservice.
I would love to be able to give everybody in the room an opportunity to ask a question, but we have time for about one more, and I've given 2 over there, so I'm going to head over to this side of the room here, and I think we'll give it to this gentleman right here.
Yeah, thank you very much. To nobody in particular, I'd like to talk about Bank of the West. Okay, now to outline this for those of you who haven't followed it, Bank of the West is one of the biggest banks in the world, right? And they've been asked to leave Wyoming. Okay, and the reason they have been so rudely asked to leave Wyoming is because they have a clean energy policy, they agree with climate change and things like that. And some of the pig-headed people that run Wyoming have caused their local governments, city councils and county governments and whatnot, to divest their money from Bank of the West. Okay, Bank of the West has the solutions that we need for things like NDOW, for instance, and all that. And also when
churches were involved. The more that government became involved, the less those other entities were involved in healthcare. And I think that's, to a large degree, put us in this position. Now many of us are growing up thinking that it's government's job. I think we need to step back and question that, and it may be the bigger question that helps us solve some of the other issues we're battling here.
I just wanted to echo Chairman Eathorne's original point about the grassroots effort. We also have, as a Democratic Party, have 23 county parties, 23 executive committees that are all part of a central committee. I've got two members of our executive committee here in Sweetwater County here tonight. We really just encourage the same involvement, and we also have a platform, but we did not bring copies because it's readily available on our websites. Our website here in the county is sweetwaterdems.com, and our state website is wyodems.org. Our platforms are on both of those websites, and I encourage you to go out and check them out. I see Mr. Eathorne here has a spiral-bound book of a number of pages. Sweetwater County's is 2 pages. 2 pages. And I believe the Wyoming Democratic Party's is 4. So we are very, very widely encompassing in values. But on the healthcare topic, you know, these gentlemen here, these four representatives, they do have the opportunity to expand Medicaid, and I think it's time that some of these guys, I hope all 4 of you go down there and say, look, the Affordable Care Act is not going away. You know, it was in a state of flux for a number of years, but it's not going away. And every year we don't expand Medicaid, we are losing money. Our taxpayers in Wyoming are losing their money, and it's not coming back to us. So maybe it's time we make the proper financial decisions and get some of those dollars back to Wyoming, and get us the bang for our buck. I seem to remember 3 years ago, it was right after the 2016 election, Governor Meade had his State of the State address, and in that he even encouraged the expansion of Medicaid. So our Republican governor at the time has said, guys, you need to expand Medicaid to the entire legislature. I'm sure all these gentlemen were sitting in that room. So I want to just urge them to go down there and have that conversation.
Preface it by saying I'm the chairman of the insurance committee. And some days, you know, we're remodeling our capital, and I feel those of you who were there in 15 remember that I was one of 3 Republicans that was supporting Medicaid expansion, and I fell on my sword and probably got so many arrows into me, we had to remodel the capital. There was so much blood in the back of the room, right? I'm still here. And I'll just be very honest. Back in 2015, it made a lot of sense. We had a sliding scale for Medicaid expansion. We were still in a very political, polarized environment, and you know, you looked at the numbers and said, Medicaid expansion is worth it, at least for the next 3 or 4 or 5 years, for the cost it was going to take to Wyoming. But now that it's 2019, next session comes into effect by then, I don't think it's worth it now. I mean, what you're basically asking is all the taxpayers of this state to pay more money as a Republican viewpoint for some people's bad behavior, right? Should you pay more in taxes and more in health care because other people have smoked a pack a day or drank themselves to liver cancer or made bad choices in their lives? And at what level are you responsible for their bad choices? And other people, they get cancer through no fault of their own, et cetera. And I was an auctioneer, I'm still an auctioneer. We had medical bankruptcy auctions left and right up until 2012. I mean, I watched people lose everything. We were selling off their life goods. After the ACA came in, because I don't like calling it Obamacare, that stopped. I mean, it did. And we had a really good chance back when it was cost effective for this state to take Medicaid expansion on. The governor wasn't there at that point. Certainly the Republican Party wasn't there. There was a lot of political tension, and we missed our shot. And so I would tell you that we should have done it back in 15, 16. It would have saved us money. It would have saved people's lives. Quite honestly, we probably lost a couple hundred people's lives because we didn't do it, and they didn't get access to the health care they needed. But now we're at the point where it's probably not cost effective for all of you as taxpayers. The cost on the system for what we have to pay as a state for that Medicaid expansion, it's a numbers game, and it's sad, but at what point do we charge citizens of the state through your tax dollars for other people's health care? I don't know, but I would say it's not cost effective anymore, and we missed our shot. And we still could do it, but we're in a budget crunch, and we're already hurting, so it's probably not the time anymore. And it makes me sad, it does. It kills me at night that we didn't pass it 4 years ago, because I know what happened in the state. That being said, it's not worth the cost of what it takes now. Sorry, thank you for letting me get my soapbox. There's a lot of issues in the legislature that keep, I mean, we're not all bad people. Your politicians, your public servants, we don't get paid a lot for this. I mean, you can ask any legislator here, we lose sleep. I mean, there are nights I just lay there in bed and go, what have I done? How can I make the state better? How can we move the future forward? And these aren't easy answers. When they get to the legislative level, there's not black and white. These are judgment calls, and you find out 3 years later, you've made the wrong darn call. If you'd had the information that you needed at the time, you would have never voted that way. And that's part of the process. And it's part of the difficulty of being a public servant and what you have to live with to be the ones to get to make the decisions, knowing that sometimes you make the wrong decisions. New question before I get everybody.
I've got one, but I'm going to let everybody speak on the issue.
Oh, John, go ahead.
When we were in the middle of the debate, it was called Do We Want Health Care or Death Care? Because one of the best things about having insurance is if you are a woman and you feel a lump in your breast, then you can go if you have good insurance, you can go and get a mammogram, and you may catch breast cancer before it metastasizes, and you have a chance. If you don't have insurance and you don't have the money to pay for it, you can't go forward. And that's the kind of insurance that we need to have. Because, we can get on a philosophical kick, and I don't want to pay for people that smoke 3 packs a day who's dying of lung cancer. I don't, he kind of made the decision, or she kind of made the decision. But breast cancer, hits everyone. We have a member of our delegation who's male that suffered from breast cancer. And it's because you had preventative medicine to where that you can go forward. It became real personal to me because
I realized that if I voted for the ACA or Obamacare, that there was a lot of people in my district that wasn't going to vote for me. And basically what happened was that it brought it home to me is I had a pituitary tumor the size of a tangerine, about like that, round, that they pulled out through my nose. And I went to the emergency room, and that was $2,000. It was $1,200 for the airplane, not the airplane ride, but the ambulance ride to the airport. $20,000. I didn't get the primo rates. Then another $1,200 to get to U of U Hospital. The surgeon only cost me $9,000. I didn't think that was too bad. But I stopped counting after it surpassed $220 million. $1,000. Hey, I'm in the legislature. I deal with millions of dollars now. Sorry about that. But the bottom line was two things. There's only one time that I was scared. And I looked over, and there was my son about 2 o'clock in the morning, and he's making sure that I'm going to have a comfortable night. He was working 2 jobs, probably doing 60 to 70 hours a day or a week. I get everything mixed up. And he has no insurance. And I think that that's the fundamental problem of the system. And it only cost me $250 because I had 2 good health insurances. Now, should everybody, no matter what their income have access to health care? I don't know the answer. There are people that have spent a lot more time with that. But my gut feeling is we got to start somewhere. And whatever we started, we got to fix what's wrong with it and get it go forward.
Thank you. Real quickly, Chairman Eathorne, I saw you were writing on a note. Did you want to weigh in? Did you have something else to say?
Anticipation of future questions.
Okay. Okay.
I just want to say one other thing right now.
Sure.
And again, I guess I am going to talk too much. What do we owe each other, as citizens that live and work and hopefully enjoy our lives together? And I know that there probably are ways that you're serving your neighbors and friends and families, but I think it's too important. I remember being on the Labor Health Committee and our chairman telling us, in Wyoming, when you're sick and you got to pay that bill, well, you sell a cow. I don't have a cow. I don't know. I've had a cow, figuratively speaking. No, I don't have a cow. A lot of people don't have that opportunity, and so it's important for us to remember that not all of us in this society have our own bootstraps with which to pull ourselves up. But what we can't go back to is a situation where you have insurance companies making insane profit margins. I mean, more than is appropriate, I hope, by anybody's measure, and still letting people remain sick, not have health care coverage, not have any options except the emergency room. I'll tell you, one of the things that devastates me to this day still is that I get on social media and I see that people have to run GoFundMe campaigns still to pay their medical bills. I mean, what kind of society is that? So what do we owe each other? I mean, start talking about that amongst yourselves. Think about that. What do you owe your neighbors? What do you owe your friends? How can we fix this problem? And I would say that if there is something better out there that can be proposed, that can be worked on. Right now, you're not going to see out of Washington because there's so much gridlock there between Democrats and Republicans. You're not going to see a bipartisan solution unless something major happens, something miraculous. But we can have those discussions here in the community. We can try and move beyond that here and come up with some solutions of our own. But it is going to take a lot of bipartisanship.
Thank you. So one last question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for a Q&A. I thought we might end tonight's panel, at least my question part of it, on the topic of civility and respect. This has been a very civil discussion, and I think one of the eye-opening things for some of the members of the audience might be to see how Democrats and Republicans really can get along and have a debate, and a very good debate at that. It's something that we don't see a whole lot at the national level for to sort of jump off of Chairman Barbuto's comment there. And many of the people in the audience here, as you can see, are young people who will probably be voting for the very first time in their lives, and sometimes turning on the nightly news, whether that be CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, can turn them off to that process. And so I would just like to say, or I'd like to ask rather, what obligation does your party have to uphold the values of civil society in the present day and in the present context?
One of the things that we do in the House of Representatives. Turn your mic on.
Nope.
Did we turn the mic on?
One of the things that we do in the House of Representatives is that we say the prayer, and then we say the Pledge of Allegiance, and then Stan Blake's, and I help, says play ball. And then what we do is we spend the next 10 minutes running around talking to each other and shaking each other's hand and asking how their kids are doing and or their wives, or how was the meeting last night. But we have small conversations, and then we move on. And it's awfully hard to feel any angst towards somebody that you just shook their hands, asked them how they were going, how things were going, and then you go forward. And even when you're mad, then what happens is you kind of remember everything that you've done. I go to receptions every night because they don't pay so much money for us to live. When we're down at the reservation, the legislature. One of the problems that I had with the brain, the pituitary thing is I fight fatigue, and this is a late night for me. And I take 10 pills a day, and between my wife and myself, it's $22,000 retail for just the medicine that you take. So I apologize for screwing up things. But I think that we need to do that as a nation. We have to sit up there and we have to start looking at each other. We have to sit up there and say, hey, Dan and Clark are a different party from me, but we can have a conversation. We go to those receptions, and we generally have a good time. And not only that is you are so blessed to be in Wyoming because you can come to the legislature and you can write a little note and we'll come out and we'll talk to you. And more often than not, we'll find your representative and we'll bring them out and we'll go from there. Wyoming's got it right. It really does. And I hope that the national government at some time does the same thing.
Yeah, I'm just going to piggyback right on.
Diversification in Wyoming, I think it's implicit that we have to get away from carbon. Okay, that's exactly what Bank of the West wants to do, and we have treated them like absolute dirtbags. I think it's embarrassing. There's been a lot of talk here about respecting one another's opinion and stuff. Okay, that's just BS. Okay, we really don't. We have some fundamental problems here in Wyoming, and it was very well illustrated by the poor communication we had with Bank of the West. And I would like somebody up there to address that and say whether or not it wasn't a big mistake and if we can somehow or other reverse course. Thank you.
I would be happy to address that. I fully support the Sweetwater County Board of County Commissioners withdrawing all of the public money from Bank of the West. I fully support the City of Rock Springs doing the same thing. Bank of the West is trying to make public policy, Bank of the West is acting like the government, and they're saying what businesses you can invest in or not. If you graduate from your program here, if you want to go to a bank and say, hey, I've scraped together or I've borrowed $10,000 to buy an old truck and I want to start an oil field business, Bank of the West has said by policy they will not fund you. to give banks the power to say what businesses you're allowed to go invest in, I think it's just wrong, because the people on Bank of the West, no one elected them. The board of directors of Bank of the West in San Francisco, they were not elected by the people of Wyoming to make public policy in Wyoming. I think it's fundamentally wrong, not just because it's of the energy industry necessarily, but because just generally speaking, I don't think banks should be out there saying we won't do business with you because you want to invest in an ice cream parlor. And we as a bank, we think that obesity and sugar consumption is a big problem. We think that sugar causes Alzheimer's. We think sugar is bad, and so therefore we refuse to invest in any business that sells ice cream. If that's okay, if we let banks do public policy like that, it sets a bad precedent. I'm fully supportive of our local government leaders and for the state treasurer to refuse to do business with Bank of the West. And by the way, they're terrible hypocrites too, because they're owned by BNP Paribas, the French bank. Where did they get their capital hundreds and hundreds of years ago? They got their capital from the fossil fuel industry, okay? Because for thousands of years, it was very difficult to develop capital at all. If all you had was animal power or the water wheel or human labor, very difficult to develop capital, very, very difficult. It was when we harnessed the energy in fossil fuels, first coal and then later oil, that we were able to generate lots of energy, which in turn generated capital. And what do banks deal in? Capital. That's their business. So I think they're terrible hypocrites, and I'm fully supportive. And Tom, I do respect you, but I could not disagree with you more.
So real quick, right, we have a $45 billion sovereign wealth fund in Wyoming, $3 to $4 billion in liquid assets go through the state. We legitimately cannot get off of Bank of the West, no matter what the politicians will tell you right now. Besides, Wells Fargo is our other largest in the state, and those of you familiar with Wells Fargo, they're not doing so well either right now. So legitimately, although it's a really good soundbite, there is no potential way, unless we're going to invest, our liquid assets in another state for doing transactional business with state government. Right now, it's not going to happen the next 3 or 4 years, and I'm just optimistic things will calm down, and behind the scenes we'll take care of it. It's a really good political stunt during election year, but we don't have any other options, quite honestly, besides using Bank of the West, at least for the foreseeable future. For the large, it makes good politics, right? I mean, you know that several. But I guess I don't want to get into politics, but I'll just say legitimately we cannot. I've already made everybody upset once tonight. I'm just going to say logistically we cannot separate our funds and state government in the foreseeable future completely away from Bank of the West, even if some of our elected officials or people campaigning say this is a plan. Maybe it'll be the plan, but it's not happening anytime soon.
Well, just to respond to what Clark said, though, I'm not quite understanding where he's coming from on some of his points. You can disagree with the move that Bank of the West made, the decisions they made. You can disagree or agree with the move the commissioners made. But I mean, what Clark is saying, what Representative Stith is saying, that this is somehow creating policy from a board of directors in San Francisco or France or anywhere else, just isn't accurate. I don't understand that. I mean, they have a board just like Sweetwater County has a board, and they're going to make decisions that they think reflect their values. And I mean, I don't see how this situation is any different than, a baker not having to bake a cake for a gay wedding. They can make a decision that they don't believe that the fossil fuel industry is a good investment. They should never be forced to fund projects or give monies to people that they don't feel like reflect their values. I mean, you can make your own judgment calls about whether those were wise decisions, but the idea that they're somehow setting policy, I think, is kind of ludicrous, with all due respect. You want to respond to that?
No.
No, I'll stand by what I said earlier. Thank you. Already heard it, and I want to say also I very much appreciate how many of you have stayed here through the whole program. It's really quite stunning. Thank you for your patience. All you've had is to listen to is all these talking heads up here, so thank you.
And on that note, actually, we need to draw our panel and our Q&A to a close. So I would just, on behalf of Western Wyoming Community College, both the student body and the faculty, as well as the community of Rock Springs, I would like to thank you gentlemen for your time this evening and for addressing some of our concerns. And a reminder to all of you that election day is November 6th. And if you have not registered yet, you do have the opportunity to register on the day of the election at the polls. Please get out and vote.
Yes.
Thank you very much.